everyone. Welcome back to another episode of In Addition, where we get to hear from individuals in STEM who decided to add something a little extra to their stories. To preface the conversation, I would like to mention that for both my guest and I, our opinions, advice, and thoughts do not reflect those of the institutions that we are associated with or work for. Today's guest is an MD PhD student in neuroscience and biomedical engineering at WashU in St. Louis, my alma mater, where his interests in medicine and engineering come together in his research within stroke, epilepsy, and other brain disorders. And on top of that, you've probably interacted with his work without even realizing it. If you've ever done a crossword in the New York Times, there's probably a good chance that he wrote it. He was even named the very first ever Wordle Champion. I'm so excited to welcome Sid Sivakumar to the show today. Thank you so much for joining me, Sid.
Hi, Nanya. Thanks so much. This is a great honor. It's super fun to be here.
Thank you so much. Sid, could you just start by telling me a little bit about your journey? How did you go from a kid who just liked doing puzzles to someone who's now about to become a physician scientist?
Well, it's been a long journey so far, but still very much at the first part of it because I haven't finished my training yet. So I started off. I grew up in Virginia, and I was always very interested in words and letters. And my mom, when she was growing up, used to solve the Hindu crossword, which is a newspaper out of India. And it was a cryptic crossword, which means that every clue would have some kind of wordplay in the clue itself. And then separately, I was also very interested in math from a very young age. There were times when I thought that I would be a mathematician. And it turns out that actually, to some degree, I kind of am in the kind of work that I do. That I'm much more sort of computationally minded in the research that I've been doing. But the one really interesting thing about both math and puzzles is that the premise of both of those is that you start with a set of rules that are kind of provided to you. And then there are emergent things that come out of those rules that are very interesting and engaging, cognitively engaging to think about. It's also natural that I became very interested in neuroscience when I was in college. I went to Case Western Reserve University and worked on a number of kind of sort of lower complexity computational neuroscience problems, but that really kind of excited me about the world of computational tools and how they can be applied to biomedical problems. And so it made sense for me then to, as I was thinking more about where can the impact of these ideas most be realized, and particularly as I was doing some research with human subjects and overlapping neurological conditions, different kinds of disease processes, it was a natural choice for me to pursue a formal training pathway in both, being a physician and then also being a scientist.
Yeah, definitely. It's so interesting that you started off with doing the Hindu crossword with your mom and then kind of that natural thread that led you to neuroscience. And I'm sure that those interplay a lot, which we'll talk about later. But you've been in St. Louis for a while now. So I just wanted to ask you, what are some of your favorite things to do?
I have been in St. Louis this is my 10th year in St. Louis. It's a city with many seasons. Now it's summer, so I'm enjoying going out to Forest Park on days when it's not oppressively hot, we've had a couple of those. I really enjoy my coffee. A lot of people in medical school do. So I try to go to a number of coffee shops around the city. I've been to Protagonist more times than I can count. Blueprint is also great. And then besides that, there's a ton of things on campus, both on the medical side and then on the Danford side, which is our kind of more, non-medical campus. I have tons of friends in various departments. And so we regularly do lots of stuff on campus when we get time.
That's great. It's awesome that you mentioned Protagonist because I was going to ask you about it. I used to go there all the time in undergrad and see all the med students sitting there, and I would kind of look at them and say, hopefully I'm there one day. So that's just great to bond with someone over St. Louis, someone new. I also heard in a previous podcast that you mentioned you played Scrabble in high school, and I felt like this was a really cool connection point as well because I played Scrabble in elementary school. Definitely not at the same level as you played it, but I remember kind of learning about problem solving and adapting as the board, continues to change in front of you. So I'm really curious, do you feel like your experience playing Scrabble kind of shaped the way that you have done crosswords and also maybe shaped the way that you're interested in neuroscience?
100%. Scrabble was like my first foray into word puzzles. I didn't really, even though I was introduced to the Hindu crossword when I was very young, I didn't really do crosswords as a grade school student. I was playing Scrabble. Again, my mom introduced me to the game, and then I became president of the Scrabble club at our high school. I wasn't ever very good. I know that like there's different levels of what being good is, but Scrabble is one of those games where there's a ranking system and such, and I wasn't ever very highly ranked. But I really enjoyed it. There's something very satisfying about having a kind of like a finite set of things that you can do, but it's just at the edge of where exploring all the possibilities is kind of impossible. And so there's something really satisfying about having a problem that's right outside of your reach. It's just a little bit more challenging than what you can do. Even the top level Scrabble players will once in a while will come up with a play that's really, really interesting that nobody has thought of before. And people don't, most people think, okay, Scrabble is about you come up with words and you play them. There's a lot of like geometry to how the letters are played. And even in anagramming, so people who do games like the Spelling Bee, the New York Times, or things like that, where you have to anagram letters, that's half of the game in Scrabble is coming up with a word on your rack. And then the other half of the game is this really complex dance of offense and defense on the board of, am I going to make an offensive move that makes a lot of points, but then opens up the board to the other player to make a counter move that makes a lot of points? Or am I going to play really defensively and prevent either of us from getting many points? In that way, as like sort of a game theory exploration, it's super interesting. I was just never quite good enough at it to like keep being motivated to play in clubs and stuff like that. But yeah, and in terms of how has it, sort of impacted my thoughts about neuroscience or maybe even medicine, I think that there is, I'm not suggesting that everybody who's in science and medicine should play games, but there are a lot of really interesting things that we can learn from games about steady state positions and about strategy and about tempo. And these are actually things that show up in, for example, clinical decision making. I can kind of make loose parallels between them, but effectively when it's your turn in a game, whether it's chess or Scrabble or even something like badminton or tennis, where you have the choice to place the ball somewhere on the other opponent's side of the court, there's we can think tactically, so we can think about what am I going to do now that's going to make a decision now and optimize on that. Or we can think strategically, meaning what is my plan? Looking a few moves ahead. Where am I going with this? And I noticed that, I'm nascent in my sort of clinical medicine aspect of my training. So certainly I don't claim to have as much expertise with this as people who've been doing it for many decades. But what I do notice is that there is this tension between tactical, what can we do in the very short term that we have in the management of this condition, right? Versus a more strategic long-term development and thinking about, okay, well, what are the goals that we have? And obviously, medicine is not a game, right? So it would be, I think it would be wrong to kind of frame it exclusively in that way. But I do think that, learning a little bit about things like Nash equilibrium in games, or learning about perfect information and imperfect information in games. These are the kinds of pools of thought that I think are going to, at least for me, enrich my thinking as a clinician and certainly as a neuroscientist. I mean, so much of neuroscience is particularly when we talk about systems neuroscience, where we're looking at the brain as a collection of systems or even as a whole system and how that is related to behavior. These entities are linked in ways that are very, very much related to understanding optimization problems. And certainly the human brain is not just an optimization machine. There's so much more that goes on than that. But, this is one way to kind of think about it. And when I'm playing a game, I'm always kind of balancing. There's always this moment, like in a Scrabble game, I used to think, where there would be a play that's like, feels like objectively the right play, right? Okay, well, this is the most points, and it doesn't open the opponent to like be able to make more points. But at the same time, I feel better about this one. Like, this is not the best play in the book, but I feel better about it. And most of what I think about in terms of problem solving is about distinguishing between this kind of like more formal thinking patterns with structured rules, and then this kind of like intuitive gut feel, and where does that exist? And is that at the edge of where we're able to accurately predict what the future is. And sometimes in machine learning, they talk about a temperature parameter, where if you increase the temperature of a system, you get less predictable behavior, but sometimes you get more effective solutions because you're moving out of thought patterns and strategies that you've been well explored before. So I know I'm talking very broadly, but like, again, this is in playing games, you get exposed to the narrow world of like a Scrabble game, and you get exposed to the thinking patterns that come in from within yourself the more and more you play. And that certainly has like very much touched all facets of how I'm doing my training, for sure.
Wow, that's such a cool way to put it. I never really thought about it like that, but I can tell by the way you're talking just like how natural these things connected for you, your PhD, engineering, medicine, crossword puzzles, and I can kind of understand this thread that's running through your mind, and it's really interesting the way that your thought process has kind of developed from that. From my interpretation of what you said, it seems like it was kind of like a quiet rehearsal of the way that you would approach science and medicine and crossword writing in the future. And you talked about sports, and I actually play squash. So that's kind of like my version of, the way I was able to understand what you were saying. And I can totally relate to that, using strategy to place the ball in, a specific corner of the court. And it's really interesting the way that you are able to do that with not only Scrabble, crossword writing, but also in medicine and, in your PhD. So that was a really cool way to put it.
I don't know that I'm able to do it yet in medicine, but I'm certainly able to. I'm learning to think about. I'm learning to think flexibly about the different systems that we have in medicine and in science and engineering, to find core, more core principles that where we can pull from our learning in one area and cross pollinate it with another area. And of course, at the end of the day, where the rubber meets the road is, what is the outcome? Right? Like, what is the endpoint that we're working toward? How are we improving systems? How are we improving care? Are there better therapeutic strategies that we can employ? Simple things, right? I'm not able to do it yet because I'm just a student, but hopefully somewhere in my career, these things will become much more, concrete for me.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's great that you have that kind of self-reflection of, hey, I want to be able to do this well as a future physician. And so I'm taking these steps to, practice these skills and really work on this. And I think that's something that a lot of listeners and individuals can really learn from, that, if we want to become good physicians and we want to employ these, thinking patterns and getting involved in something that could really teach us how to do that. And also, it's the heart of this podcast. I feel like you mentioned, learning from another thing to really help you learn something else. And so I feel like that is something that a lot of people can learn from. But it sounded like pattern recognition and the pattern of thinking really started early for you. You mentioned the Hindu crossword even earlier than playing Scrabble. I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you were able to take something that you just kind of did for fun, that you were passionate about, it was a hobby, and then turn it into something that was entrepreneurial. You started submitting your crosswords to the Washington Post, the New York Times. I'm just curious about how you made that decision to take it to something at another level. And then also on the other end, like, how are you able to balance doing that as, your full-time job as an MD PhD student?
These are great questions. I think I'll tell a really short story about sort of how this started. So I was kind of quietly making crossword puzzles just for myself. I think near the start of my MD training, which is 2017, 2018, and just sort of like doodling on a sheet of paper. If I had a few minutes between studying or, whatever it is I was doing, I might have doodled a couple of word squares. So like other people that like to doodle cartoons and pictures, I would write little word squares for myself. I think it was when the New York Times launched their app, which they had a mini crossword app. I mean, it had probably been some time at that point, but I downloaded it and I was doing, a lot of people have done the mini crossword. And I thought, this is actually not very different from what I'm doing on a sheet of paper on my own. So why don't I try to do this kind of for real? And so it turns out there's some software that people use. It's still human guided, but sort of computationally, facilitated. And after a couple of years of kind of doing this for myself, I did two things. One is that I started my own blog called Sid's Grids, which I was not expecting to become popular or have any kind of audience. So I thought, well, we're kind of in the age where I doubt that a blog, its own website, is going to have an audience. So this is just kind of a learning ground for me. I'm going to make some stuff that I like. I'm going to learn about how this art form works, this technical craft works. And I'm just going to start putting stuff out there. That was the first thing. And the second thing I did was there were a few people in the community who noticed me and reached out to me. And I reached out to a few people as well and started forging the human connections of, okay, well, you seem to be interested in this and you're learning. And I have some thoughts and some things I could help you with. Why don't we start talking? And that's really what encouraged me to start submitting to places like the New York Times. For example, I started submitting puzzles that I had made, and I got a lot of rejections, but I also got some very helpful and encouraging feedback. And, so I kept making puzzles, and ones that were seemed fruitful or would seem like they might be successful at a big venue, I would submit there. And other ones that felt like, well, this is really not going to be palatable to a very broad audience, I would put on my website. And it was a very kind of, harmonious balance between the two. And then it started turning out that I was getting good enough at writing the puzzles that they started getting accepted at the big places. But that was never my goal. So I understand that, entrepreneurial is I think an accurate but unusual word to apply to what I was doing. I think entrepreneurs are more goal oriented than I was when I was doing this. This is really something I was doing for my own sake because I was enjoying it. So really the when people ask, how do you balance doing that with medicine or with your PhD? Because it's art. So it's something that fuels me, right? It doesn't take from me. And that was the key thing. And that's really why I always found the time to do it. Even if I was working a 70 or 80 hour week, if I had 30 minutes, I would sit and noodle on crossword ideas because I enjoyed that.
Definitely, yeah. It was really cool how you kind of pinpointed like this specific shift that happened and, hey, it seems like I'm really good at this. Maybe I can put it on my website and then, okay, now people are seeing it. Maybe I can even do more with it. But I also liked how you said that it fueled you and it didn't take away from you. And I think that's also really what this podcast is about, doing things at a higher level that are not something that distract you from your main goal, right? Because you're going to become a physician. So it's something that really allowed you to continue going and stay excited about that, but it's a hobby of yours that you just were able to take to another level. So I think that's definitely a really big lesson a lot of people can learn from.
Totally. And the one thing I'll add is that the skills that we learn as physicians in training and that we continue to practice throughout our career, which are not really even, necessarily specific to medicine, but are just by necessity, we all develop them because of the workload and the demands of the profession. Things like, time management, resource allocation, sort of talking to people and maintaining good working relationships, all of those things. Come in very much in handy, right? Those are very transferable skills. So, early on when I was working on crosswords and I was treating it much more like, oh, this is just a fun thing that I do as a hobby. I was not as adept at navigating the ecosystem of crossword publishing. I didn't know, who to submit to, when to submit, how to interact with editors in a way that kind of opened the door to future things rather than close the door. And part of that is just kind of general maturity, I think, in life that I was learning along the way. But a lot of it has become things like, okay, I have 14 puzzles on my docket. I'm going to maintain a spreadsheet and make sure that I check it diligently and resubmit puzzles that were rejected from venue A to B and then from B to C, so that I can keep track of them and make sure, almost like my puzzle census, and making sure that I'm keeping track of my puzzle census as I go along, which is very much a skill that is transferable from clinical work.
Yeah, definitely. And I went into the WashU website and they had posted your arch crossword. And I thought it was so cool, especially because, I was there. But, that kind of made me think, was there ever a really weird source of inspiration that you maybe drew a clue from or a theme or something like that?
100%. I think one of my favorite themes ever was when I was driving to WashU campus, and I saw I don't want to spoil the puzzle. So I will say I want to say this was the December 31st puzzle 2024 in the Washington Post. I think that's right. Yeah. So if anybody wants to go pause the podcast, go solve that, find it and solve it and come back, you can do that. I'll tell you what the puzzle was about. So I was driving to work and I saw a person standing at the street corner with like a bunch of leashes and like 7 dogs. We're like kind of all over the street corner. Where I live in the Central West End, there's lots of dogs, but that was like it's seeing a lot of dogs of different types and sizes and shapes, like standing on the street corner, was just such a beautiful visual. And this is an unusual way to make a crossword puzzle, but I just saw that that visual, and I thought I want to make a puzzle about that. So I did, and of course I had to think a lot about how am I going to convert that visual into a thing that has wordplay and where there are, it meets the requirements of what a crossword puzzle has to be, and it meets the format and all of that stuff. But at the end, I was Evan Bernholtz, who writes the Washington Post crossword, was on paternity leave, and he was very kind to ask me to fill in, and so I submitted a big 23 by 23 puzzle to him, and he said, "This is great." So yeah, there's also these interesting overlaps between. I mean, this is also what, as a crossword writer, just as a very brief aside, the thing that I always think about is that these are, we interact with words as a part of everyday life all the time. We're talking right now. The value of any particular word that I'm saying to you is usually just contextual, right? There may be a particular word that I've said that sticks in your mind, but most of the words are kind of just modified by the words around them to kind of serve a larger sentence or like a larger statement. It's unusual that in a given day, we really interact with a word at a semantic and lexical level that's beyond just utilitarian for like, we are using the word to communicate. A crossword puzzle inverts that, right? So you are asked to figure out what 70 to 80 words are and put them into a grid. It's very specific words. And so the choice of what words as crossword constructors and writers we choose to put in a puzzle and how we choose to clue those things is very important, because a million people might be solving my puzzle that day. So I think very deeply about what it is that I choose to put in a puzzle and how I choose to clue it. That might be the 70 words that some person out there interacts with more than any other words on that day. So in a very similar vein, I'm looking for visuals and memories and cultural reference points, things in people's lives that are relatable and that kind of shed light on a variety of different facets of human life. So a crossword puzzle for me is also that. It's an opportunity to connect with people in a somewhat indirect way, but still very much connect with people by lighting up parts of their mind that they might not have visited in many years. So if anybody has ever had the experience of driving by a street corner or walking by and seeing a bunch of dogs on a leash, hopefully that memory was triggered by the puzzle, right? And that's kind of also why I really enjoy it as a format.
Yeah. It's so interesting to hear you as a crossword writer talk about, what things that you think about when you're actually writing a puzzle, because, I'm not like an expert puzzle solver by any means, but when I have done a crossword, I don't think about, the writer was probably thinking, what words have I interacted? So it's really interesting to kind of hear you talk about that, and also kind of connecting it to medicine. It seems like it's very similar because a lot of clinical insights from medicine also might come at the most unexpected moments. So I feel like these two things are very parallel and come hand in hand. But I also want to dig into something you've said before, because I think it's a very good encapsulation of what this podcast is really getting at. You had mentioned that crosswords have made you a better scientist and science has made you a better crossword writer. And so I would love if you could talk a little bit more about this interplay. You have been doing that, but kind of just like, how do these two things add to each other for you?
It's a really good question. I'll try and keep it a little short because I could talk about this forever. A crossword is a very unusual thing for somebody who's very scientifically minded, because it's an opportunity to invent the rules of a game, of a system, right? So kind of to come back to that idea, as scientists, more so as engineers, but as scientists, really, I think most scientists are not. They might be developing tools for sure, but most experimental scientists, let's say, are typically are kind of subject to the the mechanisms and the rules of the system that they're studying. So, somebody studying the solar system is subject to Kepler's laws. Somebody studying, biochemical interactions is subject to hydrogen bonds and van der Waals forces and things like that, right? So a crossword puzzle was an unusual thing for me to jump into because it was an opportunity for me to define the rules. And I don't just mean of crosswords. I mean, crosswords as a form have existed for 100 years at this point, and there's a lot of norms, and there's some formatting, right? Rules about how things are done. And of course, the English language imposes some rules, right? But the really interesting crosswords that like stick in your mind and you think about are ones where they break those rules in some way, or where the author has invented some unusual mechanism that is really satisfying to discover. The words go backwards, or they bounce around the grid, or you have to split a word in half and put some stuff inside, or there's a pun that works in the same way every time, but at the very last moment, it reverses its orientation. There's like a lot of interesting wordplay that for people who are interested in that kind of thing will appreciate, and it will be memorable. They're looking at a clue and they're trying to figure out, okay, could it be this? Could it be that? Like where singles may be dropped. Is that on an album, like a single on an album? Is that in a tip jar? Is that right? Like there's so many interpretations of the word single and drop that make that clue very vague. And so they're kind of doing experiments, and they might even write that into that slot until they realize the crossings are not matching. They got to erase it, right? So in a certain way, this sort of loop, this feedback loop of I'm going to try something, I'm going to update my model by seeing whether it is supported by the evidence, and then go back and in a very loose way, it kind of emulates the scientific process. And as somebody who thinks about the scientific process as this like very beautiful thing that we as scientists can aspire to do, it's intensely satisfying to actually engineer a thing that people are using a pseudoscience, like kind of a scientific process in order to solve. So that's one way in which it's very interesting. Another way is that very simply, to write a good crossword puzzle, and there's many definitions of what a good crossword puzzle is, but to write a good crossword puzzle, I believe the author has to be well read. Right. And I don't just mean about the, classics of, 18th and 19th century American literature. I'm talking about have a broad knowledge base across many different domains of life, knowing about politics and sports and religion and geography and history and science and engineering and art, knowing about popular culture, knowing about unpopular culture, right? To know what to write clues about and what to probably avoid, knowing about what is in the zeitgeist today. What are people talking about today that is likely to be relevant 6 months from now or 12 months from now when your puzzle is published versus a flash in the pan. And keeping your finger kind of on the pulse of what people are thinking and talking about is extremely relevant. In fact, it's probably the most important currency in crossword puzzles. How does that directly influence the scientific process? Not quite, but what it does do is it creates a culture where we exit the silo culture of science. We remember that there are other things out there worth learning about, that there are other things out there worth thinking about, that science is fundamentally a human endeavor, as is medicine, right? We're all humans doing this thing. We're aspiring to an optimal scientific process and an optimal clinical decision-making process, but we're still human. So remembering to be human by interacting with many different spheres, right? In addition to just what we're doing kind of in science and medicine, but like, there's all these other things out there. And a crossword forces you, particularly if you're writing one. If you're solving one, there's ways to kind of like guess, right? But if you're writing one, you really have to be on top of, at least aware of what all these things are. If you're not, you can still write a puzzle that's definitely worthwhile to solve, but it's not going to be as enriched by the vast, diversity of things that people are thinking and caring about. And particularly for a puzzle like in the New York Times, that's important, right? We need to be mindful of who's going to solve the puzzle. It might be somebody who is like sitting next to me in lab, or it could be a farmer who lives in Nebraska. Right. And so I have to be mindful of many, many different disparate sort of frames of reference. And that makes it actually very different from science and medicine in a really enriching way. Because in medicine, if I'm interacting with the patient, it's all in on that patient. Right. I don't have to worry about if the questions I'm asking to this patient in a room are going to generalize adequately across a million other use cases. but in crosswords, I do have to think about. That is very useful. That kind of very broad generalizing, but making sure that whatever you're generalizing is not stereotyping, right? But that kind of broader thinking is very enriching for somebody who is intending to, serve, kind of like work in science and medicine.
Yeah, definitely. I think, the second part of it that you were talking about where, the author should be well read is so interesting because it kind of reminded me of the difference between undergrad and medical school, right? In undergrad, you're taking all these classes that might not apply to your major. I took a space class and, anthropology and things, and I was a cognitive neuroscience major. So it didn't apply, but, those things kind of enrich the way that I think about other classes, but more importantly, just think about life in general. But then you transition to medical school and it might be a little different for you because you're also pursuing a PhD. But for me personally, it's, you're all in on that one class, on that one block. If you're in cardio, you focus on cardio. And so it's so interesting that this is something that allows you to maintain that kind of well-roundedness, this, different perspective, because now you're not taking all these different classes. And so when you're so focused and narrowed on one block, you have this thing that you're really passionate about and that you just genuinely enjoy doing as a side thing that allows you to maintain that, cognitive thinking and that well-roundedness in your mind. And then the first thing that you mentioned about, the interplay between science and crosswords and kind of like testing different words, testing different clues. I think that's also very important because, in research, failing and succeeding, it's this cycle that, you're constantly going through. And I remember when I was in wet lab research, it was testing hypothesis after hypothesis, modifying protocol after protocol before you get something that you're actually happy with. And, I feel like that's very true in medicine as well, where failure is kind of part of that process. But medicine doesn't always teach us that directly. So it's really interesting how you're kind of also saying that that's what that taught you. And this art form really allowed you to not only do well as a crossword writer, but then also be able to be comfortable in that uncomfortableness.
Totally makes sense. And in fact, you also illuminated another direction in which, just to kind of like hammer home the thing that you said. Totally. I mean, in medicine, the pipeline for most people who are not going into primary care is, we learn fundamentals about different organ systems, different disease processes that are kind of formally, but also somewhat loosely grouped into different, specialties. And then a lot of people specialize, and to varying degrees maintain their broad clinical knowledge base. And the nature of the human mind is the less you interact with something, the more it's likely to fade. The memory is likely to fade. So I think particularly for trainees, I think certainly being one, what like exposing oneself to, hobbies and things that require kind of like broad knowledge reminds me, at least personally, that, when I'm on this block and it's kind of not really what I want to be specializing in my future, it's still important. Not just because of the, of the scores and the applications and all that, all the metrics, but it's actually important because you never know when you're going to have a patient, and more than likely I will have a patient that has conditions that draw from that knowledge base, and being aware of what the standard of care is there and how those organ systems interact with the ones that I am, specializing in. That, and the other thing is that in crosswords, you constantly, at least when I solve crosswords, I constantly am encountering holes in my knowledge. And I think that another thing that in medicine we all struggle with, this I've heard not just from trainees but also from from physicians, attendings who've been doing it for a very long time, is you will never be able to know everything. Patients may not want to hear that, obviously, and so there are ways in our system that we mitigate the risk associated with any one person not knowing something. But it's just a reality, right? We're not all never going to know everything. And like you said, kind of getting used to the discomfort of, I don't know this, right? But I know ways to either know it, like I know ways to learn it, or I know other mechanisms that allow me to compensate for that lack of knowledge right now. And a crossword, this is a very loose comparison, but a crossword does have that mechanism. There's always a crossing answer, right? So even if you don't know this one, you have a bunch of crossing answers this way that can kind of get you there. So in a certain way, that reinforces that thought for me, which is that, I may not know that fact It kind of sucks when that's on a board question, but okay. I may not know that fact, but like there are crossing answers from the patient presentation, from the folks around me, from the tools and resources that I have available to me, that will allow me to triangulate in and have a better idea of what is going on.
Yeah, definitely that concept of, being comfortable knowing that you don't know everything. I feel like in medicine also a lot of, and I've experienced this, you're so stuck when you don't know something because you feel like you're in this path of your life where you should know a lot more than, you did before. But I think coming from you is that it's okay to feel that way. I feel like it's really important. And also another step further, how can I address that? How can I make myself better? And how can I, maybe get help from somebody else? How can I collaborate? Collaboration is so emphasized in our career because of that very fact of, we're not going to be able to know all the medicine. And that's why it's so important to collaborate with physicians and colleagues from other fields. So I think that's really important. But I think this also connects to something else that I wanted to ask you about, balancing these two professional identities with each other. Because in medicine, there's this clear-cut ladder of, medical student, resident, attending, etc. But in Crosswords, my interpretation is it's not really like that. So how do you kind of, how do you navigate feeling like you're progressing in these two completely different worlds that maybe don't measure success and progression in the same way?
That's a really good question. And in fact, I think it's challenging actually, because in Crosswords, there's not like a hierarchy. And there certainly are kind of perceptions of, who is more active, who has published in different venues, or who's published more. I think some of that is just natural. It happens in many fields. The other thing is, as you say, there is kind of a sort of, there are institutions, there's the New York Times, there's the LA Times, there's the Wall Street Journal. There are other venues out there that are doing, kind of work in more independent spaces. There's Puzzmo, there's AVCX, who I edit for. And so there's this kind of like universe of institutions out there, and there's editors at those places. But largely because of the nature of the work we do, and it's obviously not as high stakes as medicine, there is a certain kind of like flexible camaraderie that doesn't require as much of an emphasis on career progression or career stage. In order to be able, like, there are, a person, if this is their very first puzzle, but they have a really, really, really good puzzle that's like worthy of being nominated for the puzzle of the year, it'll get published. And there is no barrier for you, right after this podcast, for you to be like, I'm going to go make a puzzle and submit it to the New York Times, and for it to get accepted. That's a very fundamentally different kind of system. And I know that it is a bit absurd to kind of think of Crosswords and medicine in the same way. It is very absurd. Like, obviously they're very different. And I don't even mean to insinuate that they kind of occupy the same amount of like specialized training and investment and all of that stuff. But for better or for worse, I have kind of done career progression in both. And medicine is a very long road. So sometimes, there is a little bit of, there's a challenge when in one direction, one is, kind of like, I get invited to, if I get invited to write a crossword for one of the top tournaments in the country, and I go there and a lot of people know who I am, which is very much just like the nature of it's a small community and everybody sort of knows everybody. And then you go as a third-year medical student into medical school, and it's a very different environment, which isn't to say that it's oppressive, but just to say that like the roles and responsibilities are quite different. I think that actually this is a very important thing to experience. I think that most people in a framework like medicine, where there are very kind of like defined roles and responsibilities as you progress, would benefit from also having another area in their life where there is a more flexible path in order to achieve things. This isn't to say that people aren't already doing that, for sure. Like, for example, I know a lot of people who are parents who are in medicine. And there's a certain kind of, there is a certain flexible progression in parenting where, people can learn, people can feel that they are really giving a lot to their children and learning a lot about parenting and developing strategies, and it can be very rewarding. There are people who start businesses, and become entrepreneurs in medicine. I wouldn't argue that my crosswords are a business. It's more really just a hobby that happens to pay in varying amounts depending on what I'm doing. But people who start companies, and then maybe in entrepreneurship, if you have a good idea, you got a good problem, you got a good product, you have the right pitch, you have the right buyer, you can get somewhere very quickly, right? So in a certain sense, it is, I think, valuable for people to sort of have some additional thing that they're doing that allows them to experience rapid and flexible progression, in addition to medicine. Now, the only challenge, really the highest level challenge, I think, is that medicine is such a demanding thing for any of us to do. And I don't know that there's a way around that. So really what it boils down to is, what do we choose to care about? And, I'm certainly not going to argue that I'm choosing to care about the right things, but it just so happens, based on where I've come so far in crosswords, it is at the place where I am facile with the tools. I have the connections to have a good time doing it. I enjoy doing it when I have the time, and it's really valuable that I've built that for myself. So I would only hope that other folks in medicine, with their precious time, which I realize is very limited in certain circumstances, are striving to find other things, because it's also valuable that that our sole identity is not just physician. It is I think it's important for all of us to have other identities and remember that they exist, and to nourish them. It doesn't have to be a hobby or another profession, right? But have something besides being a physician that then further enriches your ability to be a physician. And if there's anything I could wish for in the clinical environment, it is that everybody we're able to switch a hat, right? So we have our medicine hat on, and then maybe once in a day we can put a different hat on formally, right? And say, hey, right now I know I'm on the clock, but I would like to think a little bit more like an engineer. I would like to think a little bit more like an artist. And we do that very flexibly. The people who I admire the most in my medical training have done that, very, very adeptly. But it still has to be kind of negotiated with everybody, right? That we're allowed to do that. And I would love for us to have a more kind of broader understanding that that's actually better for us together. That we have these different hats we can wear flexibly while still maintaining all our competencies, delivering the standards of care, treating our patients with respect, working well together.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's such great advice. And, from a personal perspective, a lot of times when I find myself wanting to do something, that I'm passionate about at a little bit of a higher level, and, finding myself feeling like, oh, this is going to take away from my study time, or this is going to take away from my preparation for an exam, I feel like, practicing that thing of having that side hobby or that interest be something that enriches my ability to study, that enriches my ability to do well on an exam. And so for you, crosswords being that thing, and I really like how you mentioned earlier that, you never felt like it was really like a task for you. It kind of just felt like it was something you enjoyed. And also you mentioned that balance, like having something that you can progress a little bit differently. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at it, because a lot of times we do get laser focused on this one thing in front of us. And especially in medical school, it's like the next thing after the next thing after the next thing. There's always something else that's coming in front of us. And so having that difference between being narrowed and being focused. And so when you're focused, having that ability to do something else that, again, really interplays and isn't like a separated, isolated thing, I think is such an important thing, and it's something that I will definitely take away from. But kind of on that note of advice, for individuals who are looking to take something that they're passionate about and, either take it to another level or just contribute a little bit more time to that. People who want to take something from point A to point B, what advice do you have for these individuals that might not know where to start?
So this is actually where I feel very I don't feel capable of giving really good advice on this, and there's a few reasons. One is that because I had a little bit more free time during my PhD, and also particularly during COVID, when there was a lot of kind of non-structured time that different people in their PhDs were having. I did actually have some time to invest in this kind of additional thing, which is not a typical experience for a lot of people who are going through a medical training program. The other thing is that I'm at an early career stage, but I think that the most important thing that I've always tried to do was be efficient with the work that I'm doing toward my career, and then carve out time, dedicated time to do other things with some kind of progression in mind. So maybe that's one thing: is be efficient with your time that we're spending toward the thing that our career is focused on. And the other thing is that, as with any kind of learning that we do, it is never easy at first. Like, regardless of the steepness of the slope of the learning curve, there's rarely do we find things that are easy to do right from the start. And even if we find it easy at the start, once we learn more and we learn what we don't know, then it might get more challenging. So the perception of how easy it is might become, lesser over time. So I think that the other part of it is lean into the challenge of learning things that are hard. Medical school is hard, and I've been told that residency is also hard, perhaps more so in different ways. And I've also been told that depending on the career path, being an attending can also be hard. That it never stops being hard. I don't actually think that, if we really care about what we're doing, I don't think there is anything in life that is not hard. And if you care about it, and you recognize it as challenging, and there is a steep learning curve, then it's just about making a little bit of time to accepting those and doing those things. Besides that, I don't really have very good advice. I think we all just have to be efficient with the work that we have, and remember that it doesn't quite get easier. It just becomes we have different levels of comfort that build with different domains, and other competencies get tested along the way.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that was good advice. And I think one thing that you said that I really resonated with was you talked about, maybe not knowing what you care about yet. And I feel like I personally resonated with that. And I think a lot of individuals, again, both within and outside of medicine, can learn from this that, it's okay to not know what you care about yet. It's just a matter of when you do find out what you care about, you run into something and you're like, hey, I really want to do something with this, or I really enjoy this, I want to take it to another level. Kind of having just like that positive, that open mindset that you are kind of talking about of, taking time out. And honestly, I think it's also more about, people say we don't have a lot of time in the day. Like, I say this a lot. I don't have enough hours to do X, Y, Z in the day. And I'm sure you feel that way. I'm sure a lot of people feel that way. But kind of thinking about it instead of I don't have enough time, more so like, how can I structure my time differently, I think is a really important way to think about it, and something that I can learn from as well. But kind of the last portion of this interview, I want to do this thing called an addition challenge. And essentially, I'm really curious about how different aspects of your journey added to you, just as a whole, just as a person, in different ways. So I'm going to list I have 3 words or 3 things that I felt like from our conversation really added to your journey. And it'd be great if you could tell me maybe in a brief sentence or 2 how you feel like those things added to you. So the first thing that I really got was creativity. How do you feel like that added to you as a person?
I think creativity is a muscle, and part of the reason why it's so important for me personally to keep working on it is because you never know when it's going to be useful. So even in the clinical environment, there might be interactions or cases or systems that require creative solutions. So unless I'm practicing that, it's not going to just magically show up one day.
That's really interesting to think about it that way. And I think that science needs a lot of creativity as well. And we kind of put that in without knowing it. So that's great. And then the second thing, a big thing for you is medicine. So how do you feel like your journey in medicine has added to you as a person?
It's continuing to add as I go. I think most importantly, it's where all of the thoughts and ideas that I'm having get crystallized into real outcomes. And I will continue to see this as I learn more. So I can have tons of thoughts about how the world, what I think about the world and systems and all of the things that we've been talking about, or games, right? But how does it impact a person? Medicine offers us kind of a direct, privileged look and have some influence over how that can manifest for somebody.
Definitely. I think that it's so great that medicine kind of was like that steady thread for you, and everything that you've added on top of that, whether it be Scrabble, whether it be crosswords, just continue to add to that, main thread. And I think the last thing is puzzles. How do you feel like puzzles added to your story?
Two things. One is that I I tend to look at the world through a puzzle lens now. A lot of things feel very puzzly in nature. And the second thing is the community. I think it's provided me a whole other group of friends and collaborators, peers, that I really never would have connected with had it not been for puzzles from all different walks of life, and all different career paths. So that was really important for me.
That's great to hear. Thank you so much for sharing all this information. I feel like it'll mean a lot to individuals both in and out of medicine. Just people in general who are wondering if it's okay to do, two things at once. And so I think our conversation really inspired me to feel that way. And also I think would inspire a lot out of other individuals to feel that way as well. But before we wrap up, I just want to ask you if there's anything else that you would want to add or, share with listeners.
I will just say, crossword puzzles are meant to be fun. And so I think a lot of people have this perception that the crossword puzzle is for highly educated folks who know a lot of, of things and know a lot of trivia. And there is very much a push to make crossword puzzles more accessible. And so if you're doing a puzzle that you're not enjoying, it's okay to put it down, find a different one. There are plenty out there that are really good, that may be more your speed. It's also okay to Google. And I hope that my goal in whatever I do in my puzzle future is to unify, is to find things where people from all walks of life can converge upon that thing that I've made and feel enriched and that they had a good time. And maybe we're a little challenged to think more flexibly. And so if you've never done a puzzle because you've been afraid, my suggestion would be maybe that's not such a good reason to not do a puzzle.
Definitely. And I'm going to go pick up one of your puzzle after this and try. So I really appreciate it. But Sid, this has been genuinely such a fun and very insightful conversation. And it's been so fun getting to bond with someone over St. Louis, Missouri. It doesn't happen often. So that's great. But honestly, I can't decide if I'd rather sit down with you and do a crossword or, be a colleague one day. I think it says everything about, how both sides of your story were so impressive and so, critical in your journey.
And whoever, is out there considering medicine, is in their medical training, particularly for trainees, just remember to be a person. Just remember to be a person, and being a person means you're very multidimensional. This is just the nature of how people are. So don't forget that. That would just be, and that's really what the premise of your podcast is. So I think it's awesome that you're doing this. I really appreciated talking to you on that.
Yes, definitely. I have a feeling a lot of people listening are going to walk away rethinking maybe what they told themselves they couldn't have time for. And I think that was my goal, and hopefully that was your goal as well. So thank you so much for being here today, Sid. And to everyone listening, this is your reminder that there's always something worth adding. Thanks for tuning in.